Our complete library of episodes is available for free at spotlightonpodcast.com/episodes. There you'll find all of our conversations stretching back to our launch in February of 2020. Check it out. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on Seattle pianist and composer Bill Anschell. We've had numerous award winners of all types on this podcast, but as far as I can remember, Bill is the first to have won an award for humor. In 2014, Bill was the winner of the inaugural Paul Desmond Award, the website All About Jazz's celebration of the funniest jazz artists. We get to that, and his satirical essay, Careers in Jazz, which is the all-time most read piece on All About Jazz. As a much younger man, Bill left Seattle to study at Oberlin College and Wesleyan University. At Wesleyan, he worked with saxophone great Bill Barron and South Indian mridangam master T Ranganathan, developing an affinity for diverse and interesting rhythms that can be heard throughout his work. In Atlanta, Bill served as jazz coordinator for the Southern Arts Federation, the South's regional arts agency. While building their jazz program, Bill made time to publish a book on grants writing, and he created JazzSouth, a syndicated radio show heard on more than 200 stations around the world. And he worked as a sideman around town, and he led his own trio. Bill is a celebrated composer, and his tunes have been heard in shows like The West Wing, NCIS LA, The Wire, Yellowstone, and scores more. Our talk touched on the evolution of jazz, the impact and legacy of fusion music, the integration of electronic music into jazz, Bill's time in Atlanta, and his potential upcoming projects, and a lot more. Enjoy our talk. I don't know if you've ever been on a bill with an artist where you didn't want to go on after them, or I'm sure stories like that, or maybe you've been the person people didn't want to follow. But as I've talked to other artists in our area and mentioned that we had time coming up together, they all seemed greatly relieved to be talking to me before talking to you. I suspect nobody wanted to follow you because I get to talk to a lot of people doing this, a lot of interesting people. When you talk to somebody that's won an award for humor, I think that sets the bar at a different...
Okay. Do you know Clarence Acox?
I know of him, but I don't know him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he's got this incredibly low, booming voice like James Earl Jones. He's got that kind of thing. And he and I a couple times went on KBCS to do their fundraiser with him. And next to him, I felt like I sounded like I'd been swallowing helium or something. So I understand.
It's incredible to read that article, the Careers in Jazz article.
Oh, no. You've read that? Okay.
Oh, I mean, come on. I find it difficult to read. And I'm not a working musician. People must just see themselves in it, and it's got to hurt.
I would say 90% of the people think it's funny and 10% of the people take it really personally. And the people who take it really personally, I think, do exactly what you're saying. They think I'm writing about them, even though I'm not.
Yeah.
I was writing about myself more than anyone, which is kind of always the case in my writing.
What brought it out? Like, what were you experiencing that made you have to express that?
Oh, I don't know. The first piece I ever wrote that kind of got viral prior to what we consider viral now, people were just emailing it back and forth, was the thing I wrote about jam sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Up until then, I'd never written for anybody except my friends and myself, you know. But that was huge. I got it sent to me they took my name off at some point. And so people were sending it to me and they were like, you like humor? You probably think this is funny. I was like, I hope it's funny. But that kind of encouraged me to write more. Careers in Jazz is just kind of all encompassing. It kind of gave me a chance to talk about all the dark things we must face, no matter where we're coming from. Just the weird things that jazz puts us through.
Are those conversations that players have amongst each other?
Not really. They're a little too dark for that. I guess there are players who talk that darkly, but people don't want to be around them. Like I said, It's supposed to be funny, but I think face to face, it's a little harder to have that kind of humor and have people not take it seriously. I don't know.
It's interesting because one of the reactions I had to reading it was like, I wonder if there's a version of this in every profession. What do the doctors say about, or like the lawyers with the ambulance chasers, or, and I'm sure there's other less obvious examples, but.
I'll tell you something funny about that piece. It got huge exposure because a writer for the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about the disappearing jazz audience was the thread. It started out with a quote from my piece and talked about my piece a lot. And one of the reasons that a Wall Street Journal writer wanted to write about it, at least according to him, he said it had gone viral among economists, where the jazz world was a study of when supply exceeds demand in a closed system. And so that was of interest to economists. I never would have had that. I didn't have it in mind when I wrote it. I didn't see it coming, but that's cool.
Yeah, the part about supply, I mean, I'll paraphrase you badly, but the bit about the number of people creating jazz exceeds the audience.
Oh, God, it's only getting worse by far. It continues to get worse. The university systems are cranking out so many good players now. You can be a great player and still not really have anywhere to go.
This set of themes, that, as expressed in that piece and in this piece of our conversation, has only recently come up in some of my discussions here. A lot of the conversations here, and I'll apologize to my listeners who've heard me say this a few times, I've spent the last few years feeling like it's really been a great moment for jazz, especially being of a certain generation of growing up in the 80s and into the 90s, where like the predominant discussion was like, is jazz dead? And like, is it just going to be ossified into like sort of, to just blame him for a moment, into like the classicism of Wynton Marsalis, and the genre's dead and there's no innovation. As a listener, I feel that there's more jazz in other music than in a long time, in mainstream music and hip hop. I talk to a lot of artists from out of Europe, specifically Germany, electronic artists who are doing interesting things around improvised music. And so I feel like jazz's reach hasn't been this long in a long time, although maybe it's not under its own banner. Maybe that's what I'm experiencing. But it's just been very jarring to feel like I have felt so optimistic, and then to realize maybe I had the rosy glasses on.
Maybe. I think people who say jazz is dying, and I mean, there are people who still say that. It wasn't just Wynton 20 years ago. It's a very specific kind of jazz that they're talking about, which is straight ahead jazz, the kind of music that nobody would question whether it's jazz or not. But the various hybrids that have come out of jazz is really what you're saying, but just a different way of saying it. You know, jazz has been kind of fusing with world music and electronic music and various other things. If you define jazz as all those things, jazz has never been more creative and diverse and better. It just really depends how you look at it.
How do you look at it?
It's a tough one. You know, I have a little bit of cynicism about the current crop of young jazz players, just because ear training seems to have fallen by the wayside a little bit because of technology, where people don't have to learn tunes because they're on their phone. They don't have to be able to transpose by ear because they can push a button on their phone. And those two things were really, at least to me, a very important part of ear training, learning tunes just by listening to them and then trying to play them in different keys and stuff. In that sense, jazz is sort of disappearing. That approach to jazz is disappearing. I think the modern extension of straight ahead jazz is much more harmonically complicated, largely because all these students are coming out of great programs and learning a ton of stuff. I don't think most of them have that much interest in just playing old standards with the harmonies as written.
Why is that important? Is it about shared language? And I'm not asking it necessarily so much as to engage in debate or challenge. It really is more from a place of wonder, because I could also hear some of what you're saying through the lens of maybe it foretells an interesting time for composition then, or so I'm just curious if you could just unpack it a little with me.
No, that's a perfect point. I think jazz is becoming more compositional, absolutely. And at the same time, becoming less ear-based, because people are able to write much more complicated music because they know a lot more. And so jazz has gone in that direction. It's probably not as catchy. And in some ways, it's not as accessible. It's certainly not as accessible to the people who got into jazz by listening to standards. Mm-hmm. But in a different way, it is accessible because it's got elements of rock in it sometimes, which reaches a larger audience, elements of electronic music, which can do the same.
It's like a trying to handle Mercury type of conversation, right? There's no sort of objective reality, I don't think. Although I think there are folks that impose an objective reality, but The one thing I would say, jazz or not, I find that there's a lot of interesting music and a lot of interesting music that is incorporating improvisational elements. It's been very exciting to see improvisational music infiltrate or finally be embraced by the world of electronic musicians. I find that fun and modern. I would like to think of it as a gateway drug. When I was a kid, I didn't grow up like in a jazz household or exposed to jazz music, but I was listening to a lot of classic rock. I was a Deadhead, and they talked about jazz and they talked about John Coltrane. And I did the thing that a music lover does. I went down the alleyways that my heroes or the people I was listening to pointed down. If you knew me, you'd say, you'd know I'm not naturally an optimist, but I find it optimistic for the music that the more people that are incorporating these elements and who are willing to talk about the sounds that are influencing them, I don't know. I think it, can't be a bad thing to have people out there talking about improvisational music, creative music, jazz.
Yeah, I think what's happening with jazz is great for music overall. I think that other kinds of music are being improved by jazz. I have things I like and don't like about most contemporary jazz compared to maybe 10 or 20 years ago. But I think overall, the marketplace is not improving for jazz if it's called jazz. But much more popular idioms are incorporating jazz, so more people are hearing it. And I think we're basically saying the same thing.
Yeah.
No, I'm really happy about the way electronic music is finding its way into jazz. I don't know if you have my last CD. I finally did that. I was sort of like you. I was not into jazz growing up. I was into progressive rock, and I had synthesizer heroes and all that. And I studied electronic music at Oberlin. And it's just always been something I really liked. And my last CD is the first time I actually tried to put that together. But I just love and other people's music. One person would be Aaron Parks. His stuff, he uses electronic sounds. It's really cool. Is it EST? Yeah, the Scandinavian group. They use it in pretty cool ways, pretty understated, but it's like we already have certain instrumental timbres that we're used to, piano, bass, drums, guitar, horns, but electronic music adds a whole other element of textures you can have. I think that's great. I'm really glad it's happening.
I want to get to improbable solutions because obviously there's so much to talk about there that I think is immediately relevant to this part of our conversation. But I wonder if maybe we could set the table a little bit for listeners and wind the clock back a little bit. So you already introduced the idea that you didn't grow up a jazz head. I do want to talk a little bit more about some of sort of the first music that was your music that you decided to listen to, as opposed to like being stuck in the car with a parent or something like that.
Right.
But piano wasn't even your first instrument, if I understand correctly. Is that right?
It was kind of my first instrument in that there was an upright piano in our basement, and I would just go hear pop tunes on the radio, bang them out. Somebody gave me a book called 10,000 Chords for All Occasions or something. So I could get sheet music. And even though I wasn't a great reader, I learned the chords and all that. But I didn't have a piano lesson until I was 20. So I was a very late starter in that way. I played mostly clarinet and sax. Those were my two up until mid-college. I sold my saxophone and bought a synthesizer and made the transition. But the lessons I got were on clarinet and a little bit on trumpet, a little bit on guitar, never on piano, which is kind of weird. But if I have some regrets because I'm sure my technique would be a lot better. But maybe I wouldn't be doing it because maybe I wouldn't like it if I had been forced to take those lessons.
I was going to ask you, did you have to unlearn much? Like, is your technique particularly quirky or poor?
I mean, it's something I've always thought I needed to make up for the fact that I didn't have a traditional classical upbringing. And I'm sure that my technique is not great, but I work on it really hard, and I have been for 40 years. Hopefully it's at least decent. I'm not a good judge of it. I do know that my hands hardly ever hurt, which is good.
Yeah, that's something.
And I can play pretty fast, but I wish I had absolute control over my touch like a lot of great classical players do, or some jazz players like Brad Meldo and Keith Jarrett, guys that just make every note, every inner voice sound exactly like they want to.
Yeah.
I'm working on it, but that's an advantage I think that people who have serious classical upbringings have.
So talk to me about some of that early music. What were you drawn to? What were you listening to when you were a kid?
I had pretty moderately open-minded parents. They got us all the Beatle albums as they came out, so I was definitely immersed in that. And I was immersed in top 40 radio. And I wasn't particularly choosy until I got to high school, and then everybody's got to find their thing and define themselves by the music they like. That kind of happens. And for me, that was progressive rock. I was sort of a nerd, and I really liked electronic sounds, so that was where I went. Bands like Yes and Pink Floyd, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Some of them I still like, some of them I don't. Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I can still enjoy listening to a lot of it, and there are even a couple tunes on my new CD that have been described as prog-ish. I don't mind that at all.
For the ones that you've left behind in your taste, can you articulate what it was? Like what made you stick with some of it and not others?
Yeah, shameless technique, pyrotechnics. Just how fast can you play kind of stuff, and being astonished by people's technical abilities. But some of the stuff I like, more compositional, like some of Yes's stuff. It's pretty interesting how they put tunes together. I don't know if they knew what they were doing or not. I have no idea, but they weren't just top 40 tunes with hooks. They were almost symphonic sometimes. From a compositional standpoint, I like that a lot. It's the soloing that I don't find very interesting anymore, because they don't use any of the funny notes at all.
Yeah, they're like running scales or whatever.
Yeah, arpeggios. I went and saw, actually, I had not even a midlife crisis, a late life crisis. I finally went to a rock concert after 35 years, I think, if not. The reason I went was because it was Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, although it was just Palmer because Lake and Emerson aren't around anymore. And Todd Rundgren was the third act. And I'd never been particularly into him, and I wound up liking him way more than the others.
That doesn't surprise me, right? He's very musical.
A friend of mine in Atlanta has always been he's been singing Todd's praises as a musical genius at me for decades, and I ignored him. But if you go back into his full catalog, it's amazing what he's done. He's just one of those guys that can do anything, although he doesn't play jazz. But within the rock and pop idioms, he can pretty much do whatever he wants, which is cool.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in retrospect, as someone who mentions having the Beatles records and then getting into prog, like he almost seems like he'd be right in your, it doesn't surprise me to hear you say that it resonated for you. He can span those worlds so interestingly.
I don't want to harp on this concert too much. It opened with the Emerson, Lake and Palmer tribute, which is just dumb. And then Todd Rundgren played second, I think. And he started out with an EDM piece, electronic dance music. He had a synthesizer player, and it was so much better than the other stuff we'd been hearing. And then Yes came on, and they were okay. Yes faction, they split in half, and you only get either half of the band if you go hear them now.
Yeah, they didn't do any justice to that brand. You'd have to really pay attention to know who's in Yes and which version you're getting, and I don't have the energy for that.
Yeah, I got the wrong version, unfortunately.
So what prompted you to pick up the clarinet? It was this sort of era of like band instruments in school kind of thing?
Yeah, very much. That was it. It was weird because I wasn't really that into it. I think I practiced a half hour to 45 minutes a day and I studied with a symphony player, but I was never going to be a classical clarinetist because they have to take it a lot more seriously than that. Yeah, that was how I learned to play. And I'm good at reading single lines because of that on piano. The vertical reading on piano, which I didn't grow up doing, is a whole other challenge, but
Yeah.
having to see 5 notes at once or something. And then I just played saxophone in stage band. That was another high school thing. And I wound up even recording a little on saxophone. And then I decided, make up your mind, pick one instrument, try to get good on it. And really the reason I picked piano was just I knew that, or at least I expected that it would be much more fun to be in a practice room playing piano than playing a saxophone because you can do it all. You can hear what it's really going to sound like and not have to imagine a band with you. Piano's been the only thing I've played since then.
Did you have a facility for it pretty quickly?
No, I wouldn't say that. I had good ears. I had really good ears, but I didn't know how to play a major scale when I was 20. So from a technical standpoint, I had a long way to go.
Wow, that's incredible. What were your guys? Did you have piano inspirations?
What helped me turn the corner from progressive rock to jazz? A couple of things. One was that I started studying jazz. That was the biggest thing. And all of a sudden it was like being aware of what a jazz musician is dealing with, thinking about and responding to and reacting to in real time. It's incredible. It's a whole different world from rock. That was what really got me going. But from progressive rock, I wound up checking out Return to Forever, Chick Corea's band. The Romantic Warrior album was the one that I kind of wore out. And there are tunes that you could call progressive rock if you wanted to. And then I saw Pat Metheny when he was with his early band, Mark Egan and Danny Gottlieb. I don't know if you know that record, the white one. I saw that band, and that one I really liked. So I sort of got into fusion as a gateway to jazz, I guess. Mm-hmm. But then through my piano lessons, I was really only working on the stuff that serious jazz players work on, which isn't to say fusion players aren't serious, because they are, but that's not where my lessons were pointed.
Yeah, and I think on the spectrum, to be overly broad, like a lot of the fusion stuff, if you're not careful, it butts into that area that you were talking about before, where it's a lot of soloing and just the flash.
Yeah, some of it is, but good fusion is pretty thoughtful and just as good as anything else. I still like it a lot.
What do you go back to?
If I want to listen to fusion stuff, probably mainly Chick Corea and Pat Metheny, Herbie Hancock. Those would be the main ones. I remember I was into the Dixie Dregs for a while. They were another kind of gateway band for me. But I really don't listen to very much fusion anymore, even though my new CD, some people have been calling it fusion. I listen to straight ahead or modern or electronic stuff.
You mentioned the Dixie Dregs. I saw Steve Morse open for Rush once, and that was a pretty good,
wow.
On the Venn diagram, I think whoever programmed that tour, they were pretty smart. They expanded both audiences that night, I think.
I once hitchhiked hundreds of miles to hear Rush in Montreal. That was just an obligatory college experience. If you were a deadhead, it's the same kind of thing.
I actually grew up on the East Coast outside of New Haven. So when I saw in your biography you were at Wesleyan, it reminded me, we used to go up there in the fall for Navaratri. They used to do a big celebration where I remember you could get like a boxed meal. There'd be like biryani or something, and then go sit outside and see the Indian classical musicians.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I don't remember enough about it in specifics because this was early mid-90s, but I always remember looking forward to it and it being like mind-blowing music and just a great, great night.
Yeah, when I was at Wesleyan, the best thing I did really was studying Indian music with a great master mridangam player. And I learned a lot about rhythm. Their rhythmic concept is so incredibly evolved and difficult that I always tell people that the way I use it in my music or my playing is very much tip of the iceberg, and I would never claim to be accomplished at it. It's amazing music. I'm glad I studied it.
Is there a why to the rhythmic concept in that music? Did it serve a purpose? Why is that the rabbit hole that is so deep?
I'm not the best qualified person to answer that, but I will say that if you go to an Indian music, traditional classical Indian music concert, you watch the people, mainly people who are of Indian descent, who know how to keep tala with their hands. The things that happen rhythmically within a they're large scale rhythmic pieces, and they're pieces that they can condense, they can expand, they can go through different speeds, but through all those things, they create a tension, and the resolution is as gratifying as any other kind of musical resolution there is. So the why to me is just that it's incredible tension and release, and also an amazing intellectual exercise.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. Other than the podcast itself, the best way to stay in touch with our various goings-on is to be on our mailing list. To sign up, go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click on Newsletter. Thanks. And now, back to Spotlight On. Tell me a little bit about Atlanta. I know it was a big part of your life for a while. I don't want to solely ask for the Reader's Digest version, but I'm fascinated with Atlanta as a place. What role did it play in your musical development, things of that nature? Like, what's the Atlanta you walked into as a player?
It was a very booming, vital scene when I got there. And I was really lucky because the best player in Atlanta the best piano player had just left. So there were bands that needed a piano player, and I just got there, and I was really good at hanging out and meeting as many people as I could. And I was working like crazy there. I guess there are people in Seattle working this much, but I was doing 20 to 25 gigs a month. Probably most of them were jazz gigs. Some of them were private parties, which was also great because you could actually make a viable living there very much. I think it's still, just in terms of being able to make a living, I think it's still better than Seattle is. Both musical scenes are great. It's easy to make a generalization about the difference, which would be Seattle to me is a more ethereal, heady kind of approach to jazz, and Atlanta was a more physical, try to swing hard thing. Of course, there are people in either city that do the other, but I've just found that the thrust of those jazz scenes differed in that way. People played really hard in Atlanta. You just get worn out by the end of a gig. It was good for me. I'm glad I was young when I was doing that. In fact, I went back there about 5 years ago, and I played a couple nights in what was the best jazz club there, which I had played in when I lived there. And those guys just wore me out. I mean, by the time I left, I was ready to go to sleep.
Who were the names that had maybe national audience at that time coming out of Atlanta? I don't have a big connection to Atlanta in my head, as say like a Philadelphia or somewhere like that, but curious.
Yeah, a lot of the really great players there might start in Atlanta and end up in New York. As far as guys that stayed there, Russell Gunn is still there. He's a really great trumpet player. Terry Young Dully was there when I was there. Great drummer. I wish I played with him more. Freddie Cole was there. Just trying to think of names that people might recognize. I know David Sanchez lives there now. There's been some turnaround. More than having national names there was just a much more active pipeline between Atlanta and New York. So Atlanta guys would play in better known bands and New York-based bands sometimes.
Yeah.
My favorite musician in Atlanta was actually a drummer that nobody's heard of because he has just never sought the limelight in any way. His name is Kinaboto, and he and I toured with Nina Freelon for 6 years together. So I knew him really well. An incredible player, and he's on my Atlanta CDs.
So as it relates to Improbable Solutions, so it wasn't like you weren't interested in electronic music or blending electroacoustic, but you sort of kept the chocolate out of the peanut butter to a large extent.
Yeah, no, totally.
Tell me about that. Was it an ethos thing? Was it a purist thing? Was it a time and opportunity? Like, why now and why not before?
I would say the main reason is just because in this computer age, it's much easier to have electronics at your disposal than it was back then. When I studied at Oberlin, we had like big wall moat banks and
Patch bays.
Yeah, that was the analog era. And I think probably that was too unwieldy to try to incorporate into performance or even recording. But I've been for probably at least 10 years doing electronic stuff on my own. If you go to my website, there's an electro tab, and it's got 4 or 5 projects I did. So I was doing it all along, but I hadn't got to the point where I felt like I could merge it with jazz very well. I hadn't incorporated real instruments, like I used real drums and bass on Improbable Solutions. So it was a big jump. And I was also learning how to mix, and I was learning how to use effects. And it's just something I really enjoy doing. So I had fun doing it just on my own. And then I thought I was ready to try maybe more jazz-like compositions and using real players and combining it all. I wrote all the tunes during the pandemic. I was just kind of holed up I think I wrote them a lot of my brother's house, just in the basement. And although it's not really apparent when you listen to the CD, in almost every tune, there are sections where the electronics actually come forward. Mm-hmm. Mainly, they're just pretty subtle layers behind everything, but they're like 4-measure chunks where all of a sudden I get to play with sounds and it goes in that direction. And I didn't think the project was going to be very well received because I thought it was too weird. But by the time I mixed it, it actually didn't sound that weird to me. And then it's actually been pretty well embraced by jazz critics, and our local radio station, which never played any of my other stuff, has had it in rotation for quite a while. Huh. It was a pretty happy experience for me, really. Replicating it live is a different thing because obviously I don't have those sounds. I don't even have a good synth keyboard or anything, but I do have a guitar player who uses a lot of textures. And actually tomorrow we're playing at the Seattle Jazz Fellowship, and we're doing 5 of the tunes from Improbable Solutions, the 5 tunes I thought we could do without having all the electronics behind it. They seem to work pretty well in a quartet.
Have you played electronics live at all?
Way back when I was at Oberlin, I did a little bit. No, I would say I haven't. I got into studying jazz piano, and that is a lifetime challenge. It's only when I reached a certain age, I thought, this is about as good as I'm going to get. So why not try some other stuff?
Some of the things that were striking to me was it's certainly related to the mix. And in reading the liner notes, seeing that you did the mixing was interesting to me because it's an element of the musicianship, right? Like it would be very easy to have a heavy hand using the electronics in this context. It's quite the opposite. I wouldn't call it tentative, but it's so atmospheric and so sort of like tasteful and adds a sort of lushness. Hearing you talk about the live presentation, you can even imagine a lot of it being picked up by a guitar player that has like sounds like ebows and just sustains and just these like pad type sounds that I can see why people are drawn to it because it's different. If you read about a jazz combo incorporating electronics, it might conjure up all kinds of things, but I don't think it conjures up something like this.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
A lot of people are using electronics now, but it tends to be maybe they overdub a keyboard or they have a auxiliary keyboardist who's playing synth sounds. My thing, I almost described it as being more like electronic sound design, where after we had recorded, I went and a lot of the electronic parts, although the bassist and drummer were listening to them while they recorded, a lot of them I changed a lot once I heard what the band sounded like, and they're really just there to enhance. And there are a lot of effects. I'm a plug-in addict. Yeah, I'm just really into creating textures and timbres that sound kind of unique, but also good to my ear.
How were the rest of the band able to hear the synth parts? When you were recording the tracks, did you record as a piano trio and then add synthesizer? Or this implies that there were synth lines already, like, could you peel back the curtain a little bit about how the recording went?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's my shameful, not really secret is I didn't even play piano. That's all keyboard. It's sampled piano.
Wow.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a very successful movie soundtrack guy, and he uses piano libraries all the time, and he couldn't tell. So for me, that was the ultimate. Nobody can tell, which is just great. This is not jazz-like at all because I tweaked my solos until I just liked every note I played. You'll notice there isn't a lot of fast playing because on my keyboard at home, it doesn't allow that. I tried to make everything I did really melodic, and I spent a ton of time redoing, correcting, whatever it took. So the bass player and drummer were not hearing me live, but they were hearing a pre-recorded piano part, which I altered somewhat after the fact, but it gave them something to respond to. The way I justify it in my head, kind of from a jazz perspective, there are a lot of jazz artists, especially horn players, and I won't name any names, who will record with the band and then go back and just do all new parts. They didn't like any of their solos, and they just totally redo them, and it makes it sound like the piano player, bass player, and drummer are not listening to him at all. But in this case, because it was already recorded, they were totally listening to me. The only thing you don't get is me reacting to them. And even to an extent, I could do that after the fact by fixing some of my parts. From a piano perspective, it's not exactly a jazz project, but in every other way it is. Those guys recorded in real time. They had my piano solo and all the electronic parts in their headphone mix, which was part of my challenge. I put all that together too.
Could you record to a metronome?
Yeah, click track. Yeah, we had to.
In some of those obvious ways, or in addition to some of those obvious ways, like how else was the making of this project different for you? Did you approach composition differently? It sounds like your process in terms of recording was different, but what made it fresh and different for you?
I did approach it different compositionally. I mean, one thing is, like I told you, there are always built-in sections where the electronics can have their moment. The tunes I wrote were more open, and they also were harmonically relatively simple. Not all of them, but the majority of them were not that much more harmonically intricate than a rock tune would be. It's just that the lines that we played over those harmonies were jazz lines. It's a pretty open sound. They're pretty open compositions, and they were written with the electronics in mind.
Is this a vein for you to continue mining? Like when you get into a mode or a zone, or you find a modality you like to create in, are you like a serial creator? Like, is it on to the next thing, or will you stay in this area for a while? What's your self-conception? Do you not allow yourself to dwell because you have to keep moving, or are you an explorer?
I would call myself an explorer, but I also feel like there's a lot of exploring still to do in that realm of this most recent CD. I'd like to keep doing that kind of stuff. Everything in today's jazz world is kind of changed by the fact that nobody has CD players anymore, right? So you can't make CDs and put them out in the traditional way. It changes the way you think about future projects. I doubt I'm going to put out any more CDs, honestly, because fewer and fewer people can listen to them. People put out EPs, or you can just do all digital. I'm definitely going to keep doing this kind of music, whether I want to hire a drummer and hire a studio and all that stuff to make it fully realized like I did on this project. I don't know if I'll be doing that, but as soon as my computer starts behaving again, I just updated my OS and I updated Logic and everything's going wrong. And so I'm spending my time trying to make all that stuff right. And I'm really looking forward to being able to just at night do electronics like I've done for the last 5 years. As a pianist, I'm just extremely hard on myself, and I'm hardly ever happy with how I play. But when I'm doing electronic stuff, I can just make it the way I want it to be. Maybe if I got to a certain level in it, I wouldn't be happy with that either. I don't know. Hopefully I'm not just an unhappy artist.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about, I guess it harkens back to the beginning of our conversation. You even made the comment that even from the piano point of view, it's not really a jazz album. It's hard to hear that because on the one hand, like you also said, nobody would really know. It's a fascinating cul-de-sac to drive around in, it's like, where does it matter? Why does it matter? Are you even right? It gets filed under jazz. It certainly sounds like jazz.
It sounds like jazz to me. I didn't think it was going to. If I sent you the pre-bass drums version I had done where I programmed the drums and programmed the bass, you wouldn't think it was jazz. But having acoustic instruments and having them react in real time to a soloist makes it sound like jazz. The CD I did before this one was the exact opposite. We were in the studio for 3.5 hours and did a whole CD. Didn't fix anything. It was all live piano, every single note. So that's my justification for being able to do one where I instead fussed over every note I played. And when I listen to it, I just totally like it. I listen to my old CDs and it's like, God, I wish I hadn't played that there. I hadn't played that there. This one, there's nothing I don't like except there are minor mix issues, which I would change, but it just sounds the way I wanted it to because I could take the time and make it that way. And the guys who played on it played great. I should mention them. Chris Seimer was the bassist. Jose Martinez, who actually lives in Chicago now, played drums. Brian Monroney played guitar. Jeff Bush played percussion. And I had KJ Saka play on one of the tunes. He's this insane drum and bass guy who used to live in Seattle, lives in Vegas now, kind of a rock star guy.
It's kind of a rock star track, too. It's good you put it at the end. Otherwise, it would have blown up. If you put it in the middle of the disc, it would take it out of rotation for the wine and cheese crowd.
Exactly. Yeah. I didn't want anybody to stop listening to the CD because that was too far outside their comfort zone. But I thought it was a nice way to end it.
Do you ever foresee a version of the world where you go out with a piano bass trio, but you add another keyboard player to have an electronic, or you be the electronic person?
That would be pretty cool. There's so many layers going on this CD. The only way you could really replicate something like this in real time would be to play with tracks and to have the drummer wearing headphones and to have a click track going. I could do it right now with just replacing piano, bass, and drums live and having this going with a click track. And it would sound like the CD pretty much. But that is, from a technical standpoint, that's a major challenge. And bands that do that tend to have travel with their own engineers to make everything sound right because it's so timbre based and the sound is so important that if it's not right, it's pointless.
Did you hear the Chris Davis live CD? I think it was from late last year from Village Vanguard. She put together a group that had somebody billed as playing electronics, and I think she had Ben Monder on guitar. Really exciting record.
I've been hearing about her for so long. I've hardly checked out any of her music. I need to do that.
Yeah, have a listen. It's really good.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I will.
She's a great piano player too.
Yeah,
a great person. I think I've read in your bio that you've had some music placed in TV and film. Is that right?
Oh, a lot. Yeah, like by now it's probably about 80 different placements.
Wow. How did that come about? Do you have an agent for that? Do you work with a sync person?
Yeah, I guess you would call him an agent. It's a guy that has what originally started as a record label and has turned into a library. All he does is go to music supervisors and pitch the music. It happened really randomly. He was a piano student of mine when I was at Wesleyan. He was just a beginning student, and he's a pretty aggressive guy, so he's good at beating down the music supervisors, I think, and convincing them to use my music, which I really appreciate. I'm really lucky. I'm never going to say who he is because I'm like the only really straight ahead jazz artist he's got right now. So that's been really helpful to me.
Yeah, that's great. I would imagine that's like mailbox money. Just that's all
great.
Great.
Yeah, it's a considerable part of my income, just the royalty checks. I don't even try to listen anymore because he's told me the episodes, some of them are on, and I listen as close as I can, and a lot of times you don't even hear it. You still get paid, but they buried it so low in the mix that you can't find it. Or sometimes you hear a few notes. And there was one time that it was front and center, but they were actually making fun of the music, and that's why it was front and center. It was a really bleak piece I wrote called Forsaken, and they were using it on Key and Peele. You know that show?
Yeah.
They were cutting back and forth between this really hip barbershop scene and then this really bleak laundromat. And whenever they would cut to the laundromat, they would have my music front and center, which is pretty funny. But sometimes I can hear a few notes. I've had a couple tunes on Yellowstone, and A guy I play with claims that he actually heard it and knew it was me without even knowing the tune. I didn't hear it, so I don't know.
That's amazing. When do you start the next project? Or are you still in the mode of you're gigging this? Like when I go to your site and I see all the list of tour dates, you're busy as hell. Like you're playing all throughout our region all the time. Is it this configuration or like how many ensembles you juggling at once, that kind of thing? What's the life of Bill as a working musician?
More than anything, I work as a sideman, but the percentage of my gigs that are as a leader has definitely been going up, or you could say the sideman percentage has been gone down. I got 3 bands. One of them is my quartet, and that's got Brian Monroney on guitar, and he at times has as many as 19 effects pedals lined up. So this is the band that can do music for my new CD. That's the quartet. And then I've got a couple trios. One is my previous CD, the one we recorded in 3.5 hours. It's because that's what we do. We just go and we fake tunes without any plans, and they're all standards. That's with Jeff Johnson and Devon Lewis. And then I've been to South America a bunch of times, and the last couple times I used a bass player and a drummer from here. And I have a trio with them. That's Chris Seimer and Jeff Bush. And we play some of my arrangements of South American tunes and then a bunch of originals that fit the trio format. Those are the 3 bands I have right now. I don't know what I'm going to try next. I think I'm going to get involved. There's a European label that releases music just for streaming, but they have really good success at it. And they asked me if I could do a few EPs of all ballads. And I really like playing ballads, so I'm probably going to do that next.
Nice. Do you have a preferred ensemble format? Like, are you a piano trio guy, or do you like having another chordal instrument, or like how do given your druthers, what would you do?
Well, I was always a trio guy. I think at this point, when I add a 4th instrument, it's going to tend to be guitar just because they can expand the palette more than any other instrument can. I like not having the responsibility of carrying the band as much as a trio leader does. I like being able to sit back for a while and just be in a supportive role some of the time. I don't know at this point if I prefer trio or quartet. I actually really like playing solo too, which I never used to like.
Oh, interesting.
I paid 15 years of dues in a building lobby in Seattle, 5 days a week for a while, and then 3 days a week for a while. But I played thousands of hours of solo piano. And through that, I have got both hands together and I can play more orchestrally. And the great thing about solo piano is you can go anywhere, anytime, and nobody's going to complain because there's nobody to complain to you. So I like that. I like duos where you can really closely interact with the other person in a way that you can't as much in a larger band. So I don't really enjoy playing big bands very much.
Not enough room?
Yeah, as a piano player, you can rarely even hear yourself. And yeah, not much room for creativity. You might get a 16-bar solo, and then you're just getting started thinking about what you're going to play by the time it's over.
Yeah, everybody going round robin or whatever, and you're comping away.
Yeah.
Tell me about the lobby gig. That's fascinating to me. Like, were there constraints put on you? Were you improvising for hours a day, or was it fake book kind of thing? Like, what were you doing?
That's funny because people just really ignored me. And that sounds bad, but it was actually good because I could practice. And that's basically what I did. I used it as a way to work on my 2-hand playing. I used it as a way to learn more tunes. For the last at least 5 years, I would make myself, for the first 30 minutes of the 2-hour gig, play free. No tunes, no nothing. Just try to create something. And nobody cared. They were on their cell phones, so it was all fine. You could say they were all accepting, but it was not because they wanted to be.
You had a very open and interested audience, is that?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say open, you could say, but not interested. Yeah. I mean, there were a few people that wanted to hear it, but not many.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting because it's like it beats paying for a rehearsal space. It's like the inverse of paying for a rehearsal space.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to the point about practicing, like most people in a public setting, if you hear somebody over there on the piano and it's filling the room or whatever, almost regardless of what they're doing, it sounds competent and interesting, like to a layperson, to somebody walking through a lobby, unless you're banging away and like getting all Cecil Taylor on them or something. So,
yeah. I mean, I played free in that I didn't have like set chord progressions or anything like that. And I would give myself different challenges, just conceptual challenges to try to work on. That was all really good for just my concept as a pianist in general.
Bill, thank you for making time, man. It's really great to connect with you.
Yeah, no, you're a great interviewer. You obviously know how to listen to music. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I try. But yeah, the record's been fun to spend time with. You really accomplished something that was unexpected. So
Yeah, thank you. It's definitely the thing I've done that I'm most proud of, even though most of my jazz friends would rather hear one of my jazz CDs. But for me, it was just, this is exactly what I wanted it to sound like. And that's how it sounds. So you don't get that opportunity very much.
that's something.
By the way, I should mention, I am going to compile all my stories and my jazz etiquette column into a book. That's actually kind of my next big project. It's not a musical project. It's a writing project, and probably put that out next year.
Oh, that's great. Are you still writing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have the jazz etiquette column. I don't know if you've ever read it, but that's an ongoing thing. And so I've been doing that. God, I must have written, hundreds of columns by now. So I can just take the very best ones and put them in a book, along with some of the stories like the jazz critic and careers in jazz.
Awesome. Awesome. Bill, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill Anschell. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host and executive producer, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and edited by Michael Donaldson, and our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. If you'd like to support our work, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, or visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, weekly postings on our official blog, and a ton more. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.